Hey everyone, and welcome back to my channel. I hope you're having an amazing holiday season, and thanks so much for joining me on this one. Today, I'm going to be sharing a beginner-friendly, Christmas-inspired watercolor tutorial. This piece would work great as part of a greeting card design or a little fun art piece to give away this holiday season. With this one, we get to practice essential techniques. We practice wet on wet, wet on dry. We bring in the salt technique to create interesting texture and an illusion of falling snow. And of course, we get to practice our water control, which is an essential skill to master when working with this medium. I'll take you through everything step by step, so without much further ado, let's go ahead and jump straight in. For this one, I decided to use the salting technique. It's a very fun technique. It leads to very visually pleasing results. A lot of texture gets created. Something that you should definitely be aware of is that different kinds of salt lead to slightly different effects. If you have pink Himalayan salt or regular white table salt, and how large those granules of salt are, those little rocks of salt, or how finely ground they are all going to have an impact on your overall outcome. I would recommend using salt that is finely ground. Otherwise, the effect is not going to be as visible. Okay, so with your salt on hand, I have it right there on my regular kitchen paper towel to my left. You can see how finely ground that salt is. But once that's ready, I am going ahead and preparing some indigo for myself on my paint mixing palette here. So I first swiveled my paintbrush in my container of water before going into my paint. It's super essential to prepare those bristles to take on paint, and that you don't immediately go into your paint with a dry paintbrush that has not been dampened. With my prepared and damp paintbrush, and that was my size 12 round brush, by the way, I bring in a little bit of water into my indigo paint pan, and I bring out some paint into this little puddle to create a nice, juicy, and saturated color mixture that we're gonna be painting that sky with. You can see how dark that indigo is. It's a beautiful, very rich, deep blue. If you don't have indigo, you could use something like Prussian blue or even ultramarine and just add a little bit of Payne's gray or neutral tint into it to darken it even more. If you are creating different color mixtures for yourself, just make sure to test them on a scrap piece of watercolor paper before actually going into your painting with them. That's very important. Okay, so with my little puddle of saturated and juicy indigo already prepared for me on my color mixing palette, I switched on over to my largest brush that I am using for this painting process, which is my mop brush in size 6. I once again prepared it by swiveling it in my container of water a couple of times, remove the excess water from my paintbrush bristles by gently, very gently scraping them alongside the top of my container there. And I started pre-wetting the entire background of this piece. Everything except for this little ground section in the foreground and the snowman himself, I am pre-wetting with clean water. And I am really taking my time with this. It's important to arrive at a nice even sheen all throughout. And I am going over everything at least, I would say, 3 to 4 times to make sure that I don't have any puddles anywhere and that I have a nice even glistening that is not going to dry up on me immediately. We're going to be dropping in the indigo wet into wet because we want to create a nice soft diffused out effect as we drop in that color. You can continue going into your container for more water whenever you feel you need to along the way. Just remember that this is an exercise in water control as we're doing all of this. Continue developing your water control, okay? I want you to always Remove the excess water drippage from your paintbrush bristles whenever you go into your container of water. You don't want to start dropping water everywhere. And even when you're going into your paint mixtures as well, make sure that you are considering how much paint is actually getting absorbed into your paintbrush bristles, and make sure that you don't start dripping that color. In terms of water control, when working with this medium, it's important to constantly consider how watery your paint mixture is, how much water is already on your paper, and how much paint or water you have in your paintbrush bristles. Constantly ask yourself and go through the amount of water and paint in those three things. Every single time I go into my container of water, I gently scrape my paintbrush bristles alongside the top of my container to remove the excess drippage. Every time I go into my paint mixtures, I also gently scrape my bristles along the walls of my paint mixing palette. And I am also constantly helping myself with my absorbent towel. Sometimes I'm going to be going into my painting with my absorbent towel to pick up excess paint or water, but I'm also later on during the painting process and with my other pieces, you're going to see me constantly blot the tip of my paintbrush on my absorbent towel to remove either excess of water or excess paint. Once my background had been evenly pre-wetted with clean water, I started dropping in my indigo. And I am dropping it a bit at a time in a very irregular way. I am really shifting the way that I am using my paintbrush, really shifting and modifying the angle at which I am using it. Sometimes I am using just the tip of my paintbrush. Other times I am pressing down the entire belly of my brush. And I am really just jumping around, dancing around this entire area, really trying to arrive at an irregular variation in translucencies and values in terms of that indigo. I am not trying to create a flat, even finish for that background. I want to make sure that I'm adding dimension and interest and even texture into the background, and variation in translucencies and values is going to help me do that. After I was happy with that variation and that irregularity all throughout the sky, and I thought I had deposited a good amount of color all throughout this area, I switched on back to my size 12 round brush, and what I am doing right here is I am just cleaning up some little sections. I am going into these small corners created by the snowman and just going into those little tiny sections to clean them up a little bit. Something that's important to consider whenever it is that you're going to be pre-wetting an area of paper and you're going to be dropping in that color on wet paper is that your color is going to appear lighter when compared to when you use that color on paper that is completely dry, because that amount of water content that is already on that damp paper is going to thin out that color even more, because it's adding to the water content that is already in your color mixture, right? As opposed to when you're painting on dry paper, that paper does not have any water on it. That color is going to be laid down a lot thicker, and it's not going to dissipate outwards into that wetness, leading to a starker, darker, maybe even heavier shape and defined edges, of course, because you're painting on dry paper. And so I really wanted to use that dampness of that pre-wetted paper to my advantage in order to more easily create that irregularity in values and transparencies all throughout my background, because I knew that the moment I dropped in that paint, it would dissipate outwards into the wetness, because watercolor always expands into wet paper. And I would naturally, organically be able to create these gradients, this texture, and irregularity and variation all throughout. It's just a matter of dropping in your color a bit at a time and then going back in and doing gentle moving around with your paintbrush until you arrive at a nice effect. Just a moment ago, I decided to drop in a little bit more of my indigo into certain sections here and there to create a little bit more tonal contrast before starting to drop in my salt. Once I felt I had enough paint on my background, I started sprinkling in my salt a bit at a time all throughout the background area. Make sure that your paint is still wet when you drop in your salt, otherwise it's not going to work. And essentially, if you want less texture created by your salt, you're gonna drop in a less amount of it. And if you want more texture, you're gonna drop in more. Okay, so once I sprinkled a good amount of salt all throughout my background, I allowed everything to dry completely, and you can feel free to help yourself with a hairdryer to speed up the drying process, but it's important that everything is completely bone dry before you attempt to go in and dust off that salt. With everything completely dry, I start using my very clean hand. My hands are very, very dry, by the way. If you have oily hands, then I wouldn't recommend using your hand. Maybe use some sort of clean little towel or something like that, and just do very gentle rubbing until that salt starts falling off. As you continue doing this, you're probably going to notice that there are little sections or groupings of salt that are well stuck on your paper and you can't rub them off easily. If you run into that situation, I would recommend just leaving them be for the time being. And later on, maybe tomorrow or the day after that, come back to it and try rubbing it off again. And most likely than not, you're gonna be able to dust it off a lot more easily. Okay, so you can see how I am left with a ton of texture all throughout that background that is gonna help me enhance or transmit that illusion of snow falling from the sky. All right, so moving on to the next step of this process, and for this, I switched on over to my size 12 round brush. And what I am doing here is I am doing a bit of pre-wetting of certain sections of the snowman. So the snowman is made up of white snow. However, if we don't add in a little bit of tonal variation within those quote unquote spherical sections making up the snowman, then the snowman is gonna look pretty flat. And so I wanna round out those structures a little bit and give that snowman a little bit more dimension. Even though, yes, this piece is whimsical and fun and it's loose and everything like that, we don't want to leave flat areas. And it's important to mention here that before doing any of this, I decided that the light source in this specific piece would be located somewhere on the top right. So this means that the snowman is looking towards the light source, which means that for the most part, he's obviously wearing a hat, which is going to be blocking part of that light from hitting some sections of his head and face. But for the most part, they're going to be lighter values on the front of his body and front of his face. And I am going to leave most of the darker blue values kind of rounding out these structures on the back, right? On the back of his body. And simultaneously, we know that the overall structure of the body of the snowman, it naturally has places where those structures are going to be blocking a certain amount of light from hitting a section that it is slightly overlapping. So with my knowledge of light behavior, I can come to a conclusion that not only is the back part of the snowman's head and body going to be a bit darker than the front part of his body because the front is closest to the light source and being hit by the light source more directly, but also the snowman is made up by 3 separate spheres. The lower one being the largest, the middle one is the middle size, and his head is the smallest quote unquote sphere, right? So for the most part, if we have overlapping spheres, we know that in those sections where the spheres are meeting, where one sphere is sitting on top of the other, and there is a little bit of an inwards kind of little section where the spheres are meeting, there's probably going to be a little bit of a shadow there created. And so This is why I decided to drop in the color in the places where I'm dropping it into. So what I did was I pre-wetted a very abstract, irregular shape, and if you see it a little bit blue, it's because of my water. Probably it has a ton of indigo in it, or there's a little bit of paint in my paintbrush. Whatever the case may be, you want to make sure that you're pre-wetting with water that is very, very clean, or at least that you're going in with a very, very, very translucent blue initially. But you can see right there that the shape that I pre-wetted is very irregular, very organic, very abstract. I stayed away from any blocky, stiff, solid looking shape. And I pre-wetted mostly along the half to left edge of that bottom sphere. I did leave a little sliver of white paper completely dry so that the paint wouldn't expand into that little edge there. And I would be left with a highlight along that edge. When I am painting with watercolor, I always drop in the color in the darkest areas that I'm gonna be developing. And we're trying to leave sections of white paper shining through completely wherever it is that we're trying to develop those highlights or very light values. By the way, this color that I am dropping in is indigo. So it's the same color that I was using for the background. And initially I'm going in very nice and translucent, meaning I am dropping in just a small amount of color into that wetness. And then I'm kind of moving it around a little bit with my paintbrush into that wetness. I made sure to pre-wet a large enough shape so that when I dropped in that color would be able to dissipate into the whiteness of the paper, and it would have enough space to expand outwards into. This is very important because if you only pre-wet a very small shape and you drop in your paint, then that paint is going to expand into that wetness pretty quickly. And you're gonna be left, most likely than not, with a hard edge, even though you don't want a hard edge, and that's why you did your pre-wetting. So whenever it is you're gonna be pre-wetting a little area of your paper and you want that paint to kind of dissipate into the whiteness of the paper and you don't want to be left with a hard edge, make sure that you're pre-wetting a little bit past the area that you actually want that color to expand into, and make sure that you give it enough space there so that it doesn't actually reach the opposite edge to where you drop it into. And right there in that bottom sphere, you can tell how I was left with a hard edge. And the reason this is because, as I was explaining initially, I went in with a tiny bit of blue color when I did that pre-wetting. And so because I didn't take care of changing my water before getting started with my pre-wetting, or maybe I didn't clean off my paintbrush properly, I went in with a very translucent version of this indigo as opposed to clean water. However, because this color is very, very light and translucent, and it's the same color that we're using in this area, it still looks very nice. But if I had gone in with a very dark and saturated version of this indigo, that edge would be very stark and very distracting. And right around here, while that initial very light translucent blue layer is still wet, I am going to be adding a little tiny bit of neutral black into that indigo to darken it a little bit. And I'm only going to be dropping in that second darker blue color only into the darkest dark areas. So just add a little bit of neutral black or Payne's gray or something like that into your indigo color mixture, just a little bit. Mix it up very well on your color mixing palette. You can even test this color out on a scrap piece of watercolor paper to ensure that it's a step darker from the blue that you were previously using. Otherwise, that discrepancy between your two blues is gonna be way too, there's gonna be way too much of a difference between your blues and it's gonna look weird. So make sure that you're just adding a little bit of that neutral tint or neutral black or Payne's gray into it. So that you can create a little bit of a darker blue from the one that you were previously using, test it out, and then drop it in. Drop it into only the darkest dark areas of your snowman. If you add it in while that previous layer of paint was still wet, you're gonna get these nice soft transitions. I am doing the same thing throughout other areas of the snowman's body that I want to develop values in. You can see how I am leaving large sections of white paper shining through completely. And this is very important. It's important to leave plenty of white because otherwise, if we don't save enough white, then we're gonna risk the snowman looking completely blue. And so whenever it is that you're trying to create different values and a bit of dimension in a white object or subject, it's important to reach a balance between enough color to be able to create that sensation of 3D-ness, but at the same time, leave enough white paper shining through because otherwise it's not going to look white anymore. By the way, right here, I am adding in a little bit of color into that snow on the ground below the snowman that we had left unpainted. And I did the exact same thing. I pre-wetted with clean water and then I started dropping in color, making sure to arrive at a nice tonal variation within this area and even have little sections of white paper shining through. So hopefully you can see by this point how as I drop in the darker blue, I am really taking care of only dropping it into areas that I really want to push those darks in. I don't want this darker blue that I've created with the second color mixture to completely overtake and overpower that lighter, more translucent blue. Even at this point in the painting process, we have areas of highlights in which the paper is shining through completely. We have mid-tone areas with softer blues, and we have areas of darker blues. And it's exactly this variation in values that we develop that creates that illusion of 3D form. Value is what creates realism. It's what creates depth and an illusion of form that you can reach out and touch. But hopefully you can see how even by just creating a section of highlights, a section of midtones, and a section of darkest darks, we're able to stay away from flatness and create a bit of illusion of form. All right, you guys, so it's time to move on to painting the other little elements on the snowman. I'm gonna get started with his hat that I decided to paint with a black. So I switched on over to my size 6 round brush because this is a small area. And I created a near black color mixture for myself with just a little bit of indigo in it so that it's not completely flat black, which is always a good idea when you're painting with watercolor to add in a little bit of a second color if you're going to be using a black, to add a little bit of color temperature into your black and make it less flat. So I added more neutral black into my indigo right there on my color mixing palette. This is the same color mixer that I've been using throughout this entire time, by the way. I'm just shifting the ratios of the colors in it. But I added more neutral black, and you can test it out on your scrap piece of watercolor paper to make sure that it looks almost black. And what I did is, using my size 6 round brush, I pre-wetted almost the entire top section of that hat. And I just left the front section of that hat, or the part of the hat nearest the light source, completely dry with no water in it because I didn't want the paint to expand into that area. I wanted to keep that white highlight closest to the light source. And then once that section had been pre-wetted, I then dropped in a small amount of this paint which dissipated into that wetness, creating a nice soft gray. Once again, I made sure to drop in this paint, even though I am dropping in just a little bit of it, but I always make sure to drop it into the darkest area that I'm going to be developing, because this provides me greater control. I am then able to expand it and bring it into the lighter value areas, and as I move it a little bit into the mid-tone and lighter value areas, I'm naturally going to create a nice gradients from saturated color moving on to more translucent color. And once that initial layer of very light translucent gray was created, I then allowed myself to drop in more of this color now in a more saturated version which, by the way, when I say saturated or darker, it simply means that the mixture has more paint than water in it. Okay, so when we're working with watercolor, if you want to make a color darker or more saturated, simply add more paint into your color mixture. And if you want to make it lighter and more translucent, then simply add more water into your color mixture. And I made sure to, once again, drop it into only darkest dark areas. So you can see, even right now, you can see areas of highlights that I left completely dry so that the paint wouldn't expand into those areas. I also see areas of mid-tone grays, kind of medium grays. And even at this point, I'm already able to see areas of darkest darks. Now, if you find that all of a sudden you accidentally drop in way too much color right off the bat, there's a couple of things that you can do. Number one, you can go in with your absorbent towel, lift up that excess paint, and allow that area to dry completely. Later on, you can come back to this area and continue developing more values in there, and your mistake is just going to be a lot less noticeable. Because watercolor tends to dry lighter than how it looks when it's wet. So even though right now, after you do your lifting of that excess paint, even though you might see it pretty gray, most likely than not, later on, that gray is going to appear lighter. And as long as it's a very, very light gray, then most likely than not, you're going to be able to just develop more values in that area, and no one is going to be able to tell. Another thing that you can do is, again, go ahead and just do some quick lifting with your absorbent towel while that paint is still wet, and then do some gentle moving around of the paint that is left on your paper with your paintbrush. Just do very, very gentle scrubbing and then leave that area be. Again, leave it to dry completely and come back to it later. When we're painting with watercolor, that ability, that skill to just leave things be and come back to them later to fix them is just a very, very important skill to have. Oftentimes, when you get very finicky and you start freaking out and just going in and doing scrubbing and everything like that, you can damage your paper, you can overwork your paper, and there is no going back from that. All right, so I finished up with the hat here. I did the exact same thing on the bottom of the hat that I did on the top part. I pre-wetted everything except for that front part of that hat closest to the light source. I then dropped in a little bit of this black color, focusing first on placing it in the areas of darkest darks that I would be developing, then doing some gentle moving into the areas of mid-tones and lightest values. And then I dropped in a little bit more of the same color in a more saturated state into areas of darkest darks. I then removed all of the color from my paintbrush bristles, and I went back in with a clean and only slightly dampened paintbrush to do some very gentle cleaning up of this area, defining that edge of the bottom part of the hat, and just doing very gentle scrubbing in some areas that I wanted to soften out. Right here, I am still using the same paintbrush. This is my size 6 round brush. I'm still using the same black color mixture that I was using for the hat to paint in the snowman's eyes and his mouth. Now, if you're more comfortable using a smaller paintbrush than the size 6 to do these little tiny areas, then by all means you can switch to an even smaller brush than what I am using. I would recommend, even with these very small elements in this painting, to go in with your color, especially when it comes to this very deep, dark, almost black color. Go in with this color in a semi-translucent state, not super dark and saturated right away, because this, especially when you're using a near black or very dark color, you can start creating very heavy, very flat looking shapes, almost negative holes in your painting. And when you're painting with watercolor, you're really trying to keep things light and fresh and glowy. So be careful when you're going in with your colors in a very saturated state, especially when you're using very dark colors. Okay, so I am painting in the nose, which is obviously a carrot. This I painted in with my cadmium orange and my burnt sienna. So I painted in this carrot wet on dry, meaning I did not pre-wet anything. I am still using my size 6 round brush. And I didn't pre-wet it initially because I thought that I would be able to more easily create those little brush strokes to help me enhance that illusion of the texture of the carrot. If that paper was dry, I would be able to create those little brush strokes, kind of circular C strokes going downwards, so that I could create those circles that I have seen in carrots, right? So I went in initially with my cadmium orange in a semi-translucent state, using those C strokes all across the length of that carrot. And then I added some burnt sienna into my cadmium orange color mixture, which darkened it. And I then dropped in this darker orange only into little areas here and there. And what you're seeing me do now is I am painting in that red ribbon on the snowman's hat. This I am also painting in wet on dry, meaning I didn't pre-wet anything, and I am using cadmium red light. I still go by the same kind of thing that I have been doing before. I make sure that I go in initially with a color in a semi-translucent state, and then I only apply this color in a more saturated state in the areas that I want to darken. So even in that red ribbon, you can see how I created lighter values of those reds in that section of the ribbon that is closest to the light source. And if you turn back the video just a few seconds, you're gonna notice that I actually used my absorbent towel to lift up some of that color in those sections of the ribbon closest to the light source. That is always something that you can do. Support yourself with your absorbent towel whenever you need to. Whenever I see that an area is starting to flatten out way too much, and I am starting to lose dimension, or I just want to add more dimension into an area or lighten values in an area, I just go in with my absorbent towel and just very carefully lift up some of that paint to create lighter values and add more dimension. Okay, so just a moment ago, I changed my water, and I did this because I am going to be painting in the green scarf. And I want that green to be very, very bright. So red and green are complementary colors in the color wheel. And if we don't clean out our water, or we have some of that red left in our paintbrush and we start doing this work with the greens, we can accidentally start muting out the greens or start even creating a brown. Why? Because red and green are complementary colors in the color wheel, and complementary colors mute each other out and even create browns or muddy colors. So especially when you're going to be jumping onto a very different color from the one that you were previously using, I would recommend making sure to change your water and make sure that the bristles of your paintbrush are nice and clean. So after having changed my water, I switched on back to my size 12 round brush. I pre-wetted the scarf with clean water. All throughout the scarf was pre-wetted, and then I started dropping in my sap green. And you can see how even within the scarf, I did the same thing. I went in initially with the sap green in a semi-translucent state. And while that semi-translucent light green layer was still wet, I then dropped in more of the sap green only in areas that I wanted to darken further. So hopefully you can see how I created at least a nice variation in green translucencies throughout that scarf. And just a couple of seconds ago, you probably saw me use the bristles of my paintbrush to pick up some of that paint in the front part of that scarf to add a little bit of dimension into there, because I was starting to see everything, pretty flat. And I just used the bristles of my paintbrush, which I had completely cleaned and remove excess moisture from, as a little sponge to pick up some of that paint. Okay, so I switched on back to my size 6 round brush, And I am now painting in the little arm, which is of course a branch from a tree. And initially I am going in with my burnt sienna in a semi-translucent state. And once I painted in that first layer of reddish brown, I then grabbed a little bit more saturated burnt sienna. So I added a little bit more color into my paint mixer to get it more saturated and darker, and dropped in a little bit more of the saturated burnt sienna only into little sections of the arm. Now, because this is a branch and the ends of that branch are very narrow, very tapered, you might want to switch on over to an even smaller brush than the size that I am using. Just make sure that you select a brush that is nice and pointy at the end, and that you're gonna be able to create those very pointy, tapered fingers. After painting in that branch, I am now painting in the buttons. I am darkening some little sections in the eyes and in the hat. And all of this I am doing wet on dry. This paper is completely dry. We are nearing the end of the painting process, and at this point, I just like jumping around the entire painting, keeping everything very loose, very light, and only defining areas that I feel really need to be defined, darkening areas that I really feel I need to darken, but at the same time keeping everything very loose and considering these little sections that I am darkening as little abstract shapes, as opposed to outlines or anything like that that might flatten out my piece. All right, you guys, that is gonna do it for today's video. I really hope that you enjoyed it and that you found it helpful. And if you did, pretty please make sure to give this video a thumbs up, because it really helps support the work that I am doing here on YouTube and helps others get to know about my channel. Thank you so much for watching today. Don't forget to subscribe and click on that little bell so that you can be notified of when I share my new videos, which happens every single week. Have a beautiful rest of the day and see you soon. Bye guys.